Prime Minister's always talked about an implementation period, not a transition. So if you're implementing, you have to know what you're implementing. So, and the timetable has been phase 1, and you're quite right to say there was a fudge on Northern Ireland. It might actually just the reason there was a fudge on Northern Ireland, it was in the wrong sequencing. It will be much easier to deal with Northern Ireland after you know what a future relationship would look like. The second big marker is the end of March, when we should have an implementation agreement. Then the next one is October, when everything is supposed to be in place so that it can be ratified. Now, I think the Prime Minister, sir, understands that to include the special relationship, i.e. the trade deal. And it seems to me so far everything has actually been following that schedule. All of you have all talked about transition and not implementation. So is the Prime Minister right, or are you right?
Well, I think it's worth noting that the government's rhetoric has changed, because the initial schedule, as laid out by David Davis before the talk started, was that the trade negotiations would carry on concurrently with the Article 50 negotiations from the start. So the timetable has slipped according to the original timetable that the government laid down. And you're absolutely right, the Prime Minister keeps referring to an implementation period, and I don't have a crystal ball, I don't know who will be proven to be right. I myself find it very, very hard indeed to believe that a set of trade talks that can only start in March are going to be anywhere near even the end of the preliminary stage by the time that this agreement has to be signed in October.
I'll completely agree with Anon and maybe push the point a little further. The government white paper from February of this year set out that timescale that we will have a withdrawal agreement with a future framework agreement by the time that we leave, and then there will merely be an implementation period for the gradual bringing into force of the new framework relationship. That was immediately contradicted. It had already been contradicted by most of the people who work in the field, like me, who said that the timescale was not very credible. And legally speaking, the EU cannot negotiate a trade agreement with a member state. It can only do so with a third country, so you have to wait until after you've left. Those positions were affirmed by the European Council, by the Commission, by the European Parliament. And really the Florence speech in September was the government's admission that it had miscalculated the timing. The Prime Minister recalibrated the government strategy in Florence and said we are looking at a withdrawal agreement and discussions about the framework for the future, but explicitly recognised that that could not actually be progressed and concluded until after withdrawal. The language of implementation period was retained, but the reality is that the implementation period, as it was originally meant in the white paper, is no longer the case. We're now talking about a pure transition period. Now, in a way, the answer I gave earlier is sort of, you could almost say it is the EU's recognition that that has happened within the UK. Okay, we'll no longer wait until we have a clear idea of the future relationship before we start talking transition. We'll just start talking transition now, because we all know that the context has changed. So I think there has been a very significant change in events. I think we still use the term, well, not I, but some people use the term implementation period to give the impression of continuity, that not that much has changed. There has been a very significant shift, I think, in government policy, even if it's difficult to admit it more publicly than would feel comfortable.
So do you think, sorry,
I would agree with most of that. I think the other thing I would add is that as far as everyone else, as far as the government is concerned and the EU is concerned, the special relationship is not just trade. We're going to have to talk about migration, security, research and development, all the other programmes the UK is currently a part of. So I think sort of using the language of implementation, there may well be issues that we can resolve sooner rather than later in that transitional phase as a result of negotiating the wider future partnership. We may well implement a new policy on X, Y, Z that's not necessarily the trade deal during that period. But I agree with the general sentiments that I don't think we're going to have a detailed trade agreement by March 2019. The details of that will still be being negotiated. But I do think that the UK, the fact that the withdrawal agreement is tied to the future framework agreement the UK, I think, rightly and can insist to have a fairly detailed discussion about what that future framework is looking like and a sense of direction. I think if the UK doesn't feel like there's a sense of direction being agreed with the EU, the UK will legitimately be able to say, well, we're not going to sign a withdrawal agreement and you're not going to have the money. That is always going to be an option open to the UK government at that point if it feels that's necessary.
And that would be October, on the timetable, October 2018?
Well, I think if we're getting to that side of situation, I think it'll be a minute to midnight in March 2019. But ideally, yes, this has to be wrapped up by October 2018.
Remember, the European Parliament has to ratify, and that's where the timeline comes from.
Well, that's why, because we've all been working, Mr. Barnier and everyone's been working, which seems very sensible to me, which is why all this talk of the last minute on the 29th of March 2019 just seems a nonsense to me. I mean, we should really be concentrating round about October 2018, shouldn't we?
Yes, I agree with that. I just think if you're in a situation which the UK feels there has been no progress whatsoever on discussing the future framework, then we could time out. I mean, that's still a possibility.
I think that would be cutting our nose off to spite our face. I think the main losers of simply walking away from negotiations. Remember that the bulk of these negotiations are about what do we do with people who currently have licences or permits to do their job. What will happen to those people's lives? What do we do with intellectual property rights which have currently been granted and recognised under EU law? Will they simply disappear and you lose your protection? The range of issues which are being dealt with under the separation part of the withdrawal agreement shouldn't be so politically controversial. Some of them are, of course, but they shouldn't all be. And they will directly affect the lives and livelihoods of millions of people. So I think to simply say, relatively at the last minute, that because we're not getting our way on the future trade relationship, it's not moving as fast as we would like it, when we've been told repeatedly that it's not going to move that fast, it's going to take time, would be cutting our nose off to spite our face, and the main people we would be damaging are ourselves. It would be our businesses, our citizens, our economy that would suffer the consequences. So I think this brinkmanship, frankly, doesn't come across as very credible. We all want to get an agreement, and we all want to stop damage being done to people and their lives and their businesses. And I think to link up in a sort of highly contingent way the separation issues with the future relationship issues is not coming across terribly credibly.
But just briefly, but isn't that probably the government's strategy? To stop me complaining at this time about what's going on, and by the time we get to October 18, the government said, well, actually, Peter, you were probably right, but we're too far down the road now, so we can't possibly have a no deal. Wouldn't that be quite a reasonable, not a fudge strategy, but a diplomatic strategy for the government?
That's not the most compelling argument. The compelling argument about no deal isn't we've wasted time and effort negotiating a deal. It is, as Michael said, the sheer human cost of no deal. And
but you could do a no deal now and tell British industry you're coming out on global trade rules and give them effectively from now all the way through to March 2019. But you can't do that at the end of October 2018 because it would be clearly too short a period.
Not now or in October 2018 will make no difference. In a situation which I mentioned before, we are effectively asking every other member of the WTO to even regularise our membership status because we have no idea what the terms of our world trade would be, even now. To say no deal now is no different than saying no deal in October 2018. We are not in a position to cope with the consequences without causing enormous damage to our own economy and society. And I think that's
this biggest economy in the world would somehow have some huge damage if it decided to go alone. Is that the case? Is that the case? So some huge damage will be done to the British economy, the fifth biggest economy in the world, just because it makes a decision it wants to run its own affairs.
Well, there are two separate issues, aren't there? The first is the Article 50, which, as Michael said, is sorting out the loose ends of membership, which is to do with issues of legal certainty, regulation, safety in industries like the airline industry, where everyone has an interest in getting this agreement. It just makes life easier for everyone. Then there's a second issue about if we fall back on world trade terms, having got the Article 50 deal. Most economists would think that will probably be less good for the economy than other options, than having a deep and meaningful trading relationship with the European Union. I don't think anyone's suggesting that that would be Armageddon. The real nightmare scenario would be the first part, not having the Article 50 deal, which means all certainty gets drained out of business interaction and we don't know which frameworks we're operating under. I think it's very, very important to distinguish between the two.